Welcome to Talking Business, a podcast produced in Melbourne, Australia. The podcast is available on the Acast site, mine website, the Apple Podcast Store, or wherever you go to get your podcasts. Or you can get it at the Business Acumen website at www.businessacumen.biz or at Banking Day. For the most exclusive access to leading economists and business leaders from around the world, subscribe to Talking Business from my website, leongettler.com. I am Leon Gettler. My job is to review and monitor the week's news in business, finance and economics. I bring it all to you every week. This is episode number 24 in our series for 2024, and today's date is Friday, July the 12th. First, I'll be talking to Leslie Chong, the CEO MD of Imugene, and has been instrumental in building it from a new company with one technology to a leader in Australian biotech with 5 different clinical trials underway targeting a multitude of cancer types. And I'll talk to economist Saul Leslie about how Australia will be faring with the latest inflation figures. But first, let's talk to Leslie Chong.
Well, Leslie, tell me about the immunotherapies that your company's introducing.
So we have a few immunotherapies that we're developing, and it's all about trying to elongate survival in certain kinds of cancer patients. And so we have what's called an allogeneic chimeric antigen T-cell therapeutics. And I know that's a mouthful, but we call it allo CAR T for short. And that is in a kind of a late stage lymphoma patient who has failed off of several different blockbuster medicines. So it's a very important and unmet need. So we've got this allo CAR T is currently in phase 1B doing a confirmation study before we start a registrational study. So that's the last phase before you market. So that is probably the most progressed in our pipeline. And then we have these things that are called oncolytic virus. So I think the whole world absolutely knows about viruses, given that we've just gone through COVID. And I hear that COVID's on the rise just recently, but this is a virus. This is a friendly virus. It kills off your tumors. And we know that it does this, in fact, because we're currently in a phase 1 study with it. We have more than roughly, 45 patients on the study that prove that our virus actually infects only tumor cells. And then we have another product that we call onCARlytic. So the CAR T I mentioned earlier, this is another means of bringing this fantastic results in blood cancers now into solid tumors that make up something like 90% of cancer types. So I know I said a lot there, and they're all about waking up your immune system so that it does what it's supposed to do, and that is to clean off your cancer.
So you're dealing with lymphomas, you're dealing with blood cancers. What other cancers would it deal with?
So we have bile tract cancers, anything pretty much in the digestive cavity we're dealing with. We have a study in colorectal. We've also treated breast cancer patients, head and neck, you name it. So all levels of solid tumors. Our oncolytic viruses just tends to replicate only in malignant and tumor cells.
Bowel cancers as well?
Absolutely. Yes. Bowel cancers, bowel tract cancers. That's the whole class of cholangiocarcinoma.
And so how long have you been developing this?
Oh my gosh. So I've been in cancer drug development for most of my adult life, going on something like 26 years now. But I joined Imugene roughly around late 2015 and have been here since. And we have been trying to fight off cancers. And I'm really, really proud to say every single product or every single platform product that we have has led to a complete response, and some going on 3.5 years of complete remission. So our product is quite active.
How do you find the issue of working with an ASX listed company? You'd have a whole lot of governance issues, surely.
Well, so that is easy for me and the company, because you should always act above board. There is nothing that we're doing. And also developing cancer drug medication comes with the rigor of the regulatory, be it the FDA, be it the TGA. So we're already governed by probably even a higher governmental structure than just ASX. So it's fairly easy for us to comply.
So you'd have a whole lot of regulatory issues already to work with.
So we have regulatory requirements that we understand fully, having developed drug drugs for most of my adult life. So, and my team as well, because all of us have been at bigger pharmas or biotech companies that is governed by so many regulatory bodies. So we understand it quite well. Good laboratory practices to good clinical practices are these are all ordained by the government in terms of treating human beings, which should be there. So we're already compliant in so many ways.
So who are your main investors, if I can ask?
So we have institutional investors. The founder and the chair, Mr. Paul Hopper, is the biggest investor in the company. He's the highest shareholder, as well as we've got a few, because we are in the ASX 300. We had Vanguard, BlackRock, JP Morgan, some of the bigger institutions, and then we also have a lot of retail investors.
Okay, so you have a lot of very solid institutional money behind you.
Well, because we're in the ASX, they came in with the indices, so they are there. We have more retail investors on our register.
Can I ask, how are you going to take your findings globally?
We already function and we already have clinical trials in the US. So they're quite aware, and pharmaceutical companies keep a keen eye on small biotech companies like ours. And because we all come from big US biotech or big US pharma, we have lots of friends and connections there that are, we keep watch. I know that they keep watch on us, and we certainly keep tabs on what they're looking for. So I think we do it by practice, really. US happens to be a large body of human beings that suffer from cancer, so it's fairly easy to do cancer studies there. And we also have cancer studies and trials running in Australia as well.
One of the things that features in the US market too in biotech is a lot of venture capital goes into that. Australia's venture capital seems to be less interested in biotech companies and more interested in things like mining.
Well, that has been notoriously so. People tend to understand mining so much more than biotech. I mean, biotech is a very complicated space. And you're right, the US does have a better knowledge base for medical life sciences. And that's why there's bigger VCs and bigger institutional investors there. But I think that we, having been in Australia and on the ASX experience for going on 9 years now, it's starting to change, especially with companies like ours that are doing cancer clinical drug development. People are starting to wake up to the fact that this could be a speculative market. However, it is interesting, and people have we have been funded well, and people have arguably made money from the company.
So where do you see the company in 5 years from now?
I think that the company will be in good hands with some of our products being in large pharmaceutical company finishing out their phase 3 and just getting ready to market. We may still either, exist as a company or have been bought out, I dare say, and or we will have some products that are in the late stage, and maybe we'll market some of the products ourselves. So lots of choices and opportunities for us.
Well, this is one of the fascinating things with biotech I've noticed, because it's always long time frames in your development.
It can be, certainly, but if immunotherapies have proven such compelling responses, and that means efficacy rate, if you can show the regulatory bodies that your drug can work better than the existing standard of care, and we're talking about, in some cases, in certain indications, chemo or radiation, you could get a faster regulatory approval, such as our bile tract cancer. We already have an FDA fast track designation, meaning if we put a package together, the regulatory process could be faster, and we've already been given that designation.
So we will wait to see what happens to you in a few years' time. That'll be quite fascinating to watch.
I think in the next 2 years, really, you're going to see lots of excitement, especially with our allo CAR T that I spoke about earlier in late stage blood cancer types. That is currently in a confirmation study to go to a registrational process. And that's just, if you're talking about it in a few years or in 2 years' time, it's quite short.
So it's just the beginning.
It is. That one I would consider almost in late stage development.
Right. Okay. Well, Leslie, it's been fantastic talk to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Leon.
And now let's talk to economist Saul Eslake.
Well, Saul, the latest inflation figures show that Australia's not doing that well. And there's been all sorts of predictions about the RBA raising interest rates and how this downturn is going to be worse than the GFC because of the rising number of insolvencies. What's your view about that?
Well, there's no doubt that the inflation figures released in the last week of June were bad. You can't cut them any other way. The annual inflation rate, as measured by the monthly CPI indicator, has crept up from a low of 3.4% in the first 3 months of this year to 4% as of May. And that's heading in the wrong direction by an uncomfortable margin. So there's little doubt that the Reserve Bank Board, when it meets in early August, will again have on the table the option of raising interest rates. And the case for doing that will be a bit stronger than it was at each of the last two board meetings. But that doesn't mean that the case is overwhelming. First of all, the Reserve Bank knows that the monthly CPI indicator, as it's called, is an incomplete measure of inflation, and it doesn't carry as much weight in its deliberations as the more comprehensive quarterly data does, which it will have for the June quarter in time for the next meeting of the Reserve Bank Board. Second, the Reserve Bank will likely have figured out that if monthly inflation over the next 4 months averages the same as it has done over the past 6, namely 0.33% per month, then arithmetically the headline inflation rate will decline from 4% over the year to May to 3% over the year to September, after which it will again get sticky and not fall any further unless the monthly inflation rate itself falls. Third, I suspect that although the June quarter inflation figure, which will carry weight with the board, will be higher than the 3.8% over the year which the Reserve Bank forecast in February, I'm not convinced that it will regard the amount by which inflation will have exceeded that forecast as material, that is, sufficiently large to prompt it to take what would be a significant step of raising interest rates again. And if it were to do that, history tells us that it wouldn't just be one increase in interest rates, it would probably be at least two. As I've said in these podcasts before and elsewhere, the Reserve Bank has taken a conscious decision, has pursued a conscious strategy of tolerating inflation being above its target band for longer than its peers in the US, Canada, the UK, and New Zealand have been willing to tolerate inflation being above their respective targets in order to preserve as much as it can of the gains that were made in 2021 and 2022 in reducing unemployment and underemployment to levels that prior to then were thought unattainable. And I don't think that they will be deflected from that course by the fact that inflation has been, uncomfortably higher than they had hoped it would be in the past 2 or 3 months.
So do you see the prospect? You don't see the prospect of them raising rates. That's correct?
No, I can understand that they will be discussing whether they should raise interest rates. There is an argument for raising interest rates, but I don't think it will be the argument that at the end of the day comes out on top.
Well, raising interest rates would be a big call. I mean, the Financial Review ran a piece last Saturday saying there was a 50-50 chance of recession if the RBA raises rates. And certainly that would be on the RBA's mind, wouldn't it?
Well, yes, it would be a matter to which they would give considerable weight, bearing in mind that the Reserve Bank, unlike some other central banks around the world, does have a dual mandate. In other words, it is required by its enabling legislation and by the agreement that the board has reached with the Treasurer that was rewritten late last year after the review of the Reserve Bank. It's required to give weight to full employment or to unemployment as it is to inflation. And there are trade-offs between the two of those things from time to time, although over the long run, low and stable inflation is one of the best guarantees of low and stable unemployment that we can have. But in the short term, there are often trade-offs between those two objectives, and the Reserve Bank has made one. If they were to raise rates again, bearing in mind that we've actually had 5 consecutive quarters of negative per capita real growth, that is, after taking out the impact of population growth on economic activity, and bearing in mind that population growth has now peaked and will slow over the coming year, if the Reserve Bank were to raise rates, say, by 0.5 percentage point in 2 steps over the next few months, I think we probably could have a real, in inverted commas, recession. That is something the media would call a recession, entailing at least 2 quarters of negative growth in real GDP without adjusting for changes in the population. And I don't think that's a price that the Reserve Bank is willing to pay for what is, at this stage, undoubtedly an overshoot, but nonetheless a relatively small overshoot on the inflation front.
Right. Okay. But the issue is with unemployment, and that's rising.
Well, yes, it is, but it's rising not because people are being sacked. They're not. Employment is continuing to grow. It's because the number of people entering the labour market and looking for work is growing at a faster rate than employment itself is growing. And most of that growth is in people aged between 15 and 24. Among whom the unemployment rate has risen by something like 2.5 percentage points, whereas the unemployment rate among people aged over 25 has risen by just 0.2 percentage points. And it would seem, from looking at the employment data in some detail, that employers who are confronted with a need to reduce their labour costs because their sales revenue is declining in line with slowing growth in household consumption, they are choosing to manage their labour costs by reducing the hours worked by their workers where they are able to make those adjustments, and by holding back from filling vacancies, which, although they've declined over the last 2 years, are still well above their long-run average. What employers are not doing in any large numbers, although there are obviously some individual examples of it happening, but what employers are not in aggregate doing is sacking people in the way that they have done during previous downturns. And that could be because of the very recent experience so many employers have had of how difficult it can be to retain and recruit staff when things turn around. It could be because employers, whilst acknowledging that the economy is slowing, expect that the slowdown will be short-lived, and they don't want to go through the hassle of sacking people and then having to find new recruits when business picks up again in what they think will be a fairly short order of time. And that helps explain why productivity growth has been slowing, that employers have kept staff on, even though they haven't necessarily had things for them to do 100% of the time for which they're being paid. And slower productivity growth is a reflection of that. So, it's a delicate balance for the Reserve Bank, and there are risks that they could get it wrong. They know that. But my sense is that although inflation has been higher than they would have hoped and have forecast, the amount by which inflation has exceeded their forecasts isn't enough to prompt them to make what would be a very significant change in their monetary policy strategy.
So are we still expecting an interest rate cut next year?
I think that's plausible. Since the last increase in interest rates in November 2023, I have been saying that I didn't think there was much chance of a rate cut in 2024 at all, even though, for the first few months of this year, it was the consensus opinion that there'd be at least one, and some reputable forecasters were suggesting there could be 3 reductions in interest rates this year. I've never thought that. I have for a long time thought that the earliest you would see the Reserve Bank cutting interest rates would be February of next year. I still think that's plausible, but the risks are growing that it will take longer for the Reserve Bank to be satisfied that inflation is going to be back within the target range sustainably. And if that's right, then it will take longer to start cutting rates. And yeah, that's irrespective of when other central banks around the world start cutting rates. We've already seen the Canadian Central Bank and the European Central Bank cut rates. I suspect we will see the Bank of England cut rates fairly soon after the election to be held this month. The Fed may well cut interest rates in November or December this year, but it's important to remember in this context that the RBA was later than all of those other central banks to start raising rates, and it's raised them by less, and in some cases significantly less than those other central banks. So it stands to reason that inflation will be slower to come down here than it will be in countries where the central banks have been more aggressive, and it has been, and that the Reserve Bank will be later to start cutting rates than in those countries where central banks started raising rates earlier and raised them by more.
So if it's not February, would it be perhaps June?
If it's not February, it might be more likely May, given that historically the Reserve Bank has been more likely to initiate monetary policy changes in the middle months of each quarter, because they're the months immediately after the release of quarterly CPI data, on which the Reserve Bank places very considerable weight. The timing could perhaps be complicated by when the federal election is called, although on 2 occasions now in the past 15 years, the Reserve Bank has demonstrated that if it thinks it needs to adjust monetary policy during an election campaign, it will do that.
Right, okay. And of course, if Donald Trump is elected in the US, the Fed will be cutting rates. Fed is expected to be cutting rates.
Well, I'm not sure about that. I think if the Fed thinks inflation is under control over the latter part of this year, then it will cut rates after the election. But longer term, Trump's policies of imposing a 10% tariff on everything imported to the United States and a 60% tariff on things imported to the United States from China will put upward pressure on inflation and hence on interest rates. Trump's policies of extending the tax cuts that are due to expire next year, potentially indefinitely, will put upward pressure on the US budget deficit and potentially on US interest rates. And Trump's threats to the independence of the Federal Reserve might also put upward pressure on longer term US interest rates. So I wouldn't bet the ranch that the prospect of a convicted felon returning to the presidency in January 2025 will be good news for interest rates.
Well, Saul, thank you so much for your time again.
That's a pleasure, Leon. Thank you for having me.
So what's happening in the news? Well, France is on track for a hung parliament on Sunday's election, with a leftist alliance of a new Popular Front unexpectedly taking the top spot ahead of the far right, in a major upset that was set to prevent Marine Le Pen's National Rally, or RN, from running the government. The new Popular Front's members include France Unbowed, LFI, led by the radical left firebrand Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Founded in 2016, LFI is radical left and populist, believing that traditional parties and political organisations no longer serve democracy. Second comes the Socialist Party, or PS, the mainstream centre-left party of François Mitterrand and François Hollande. Social democratic and pro-European, it was for decades the largest party of the French left, but scored less than 2% in the 2022 presidential election. The French Green Party, or LEEELV, is the latest iteration of a movement founded in 1984. It has had 2 spells in government, joining a left-wing alliance with the PS and Doc Communists in 1997, when its then leader, Dominique Voynet, was Environment Minister, and another in 2012 under Hollande's socialist presidency. The French Communist Party, PCF, one of Europe's oldest, was long the main force on the post-war French left, and also served in Lionel Jospin's PS-led government from 1997 to 2002. It still aims to overcome capitalism, but is pragmatic about doing it. The outcome, if confirmed, will leave Parliament divided in 3 big groups, with hugely different platforms and no tradition of working together. The RN was set to come third, according to pollsters' projections based on early results. It looks like the anti-far-right parties really got a lot of support, said Simon Harvey, head of FX analysis and Monex Europe in London. But fundamentally, from a market perspective, there's no difference in terms of the outcome. there's really going to be a vacuum when it comes to France's legislative ability. The bond market is going to be the real place to look at. There might be a bit of a gap lower in French bonds. While the initial French election results still raise many questions, financial markets are likely to greet the vote with some relief. The results appear to show that the more moderate forces still ally in the second round against more extreme candidates, which also has repercussions for the next presidential election, said Jean Vogt Gerish, chief market analyst at Nordea in Helsinki. That said, the economic program of the left is in many ways much more problematic than that of the right, and while the left will not be able to govern on their own, the outlook for French public finances deteriorates further with these results. It is thus reasonable to expect somewhat higher risk premium in French assets to prevail also beyond the initial market reaction. And now, France's answer to the UK's Jeremy Corbyn, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, is already arguing that he should be in charge of, well, everything. Macron may already be wondering if it would have been easier to do a deal with Le Pen, someone who at least seems to grasp that market opinions matter, as opposed to someone who is actively hostile to markets. What's French for be careful what you wish for? And Australia has some of the worst real wage growth of the OECD's 38 member nations, lagging behind the United Kingdom, United States and Canada, exposing the federal government's struggle to deliver on its election commitment to get real wages moving as inflation remains high. The latest employment outlook from the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development found real wages in Australia remained 4.8% below pre-pandemic levels. Australia was one of 16 member countries whose real incomes have gone backwards since the end of 2019. It fell well below the OECD average of 3.5% real wage growth over the same period. The OECD also found that while the minimum wage was 22.7% higher in dollar terms than in May 2019, when accounting for inflation, it had grown by only 2.3% over the same period, trailing the results in most OECD countries. And customers have been prevented from placing orders with Booktopia-operated websites after administrators axed 165 jobs at the embattled bookseller, where dozens of interested parties are circling the carcass that remains of the business. Only 18 employees remain at Booktopia after administrators from McGrath-Nicol, appointed in early June, assessed that the funds available to the business were insufficient to keep most jobs. Expressions of interest in Booktopia's assets closed on Monday, with an administrator confirming about 60 parties had thrown their hat in the ring for the entire business or parts of it, such as its automated fulfilment centres. Rival book chain Dymocks chief executive Mark Newman previously said it would be silly not to have a look and see if there's anything there that might be useful to it. Administrators generally prioritise offers that allow the business to be sold as a going concern, but ultimately will assess what the best option is for returning the highest value to creditors. Customers who try to buy items from websites owned by Booktopia, which also owns the Angus and Robertson website and publisherservices.com.au, will be greeted by a banner message stating "Payment gateway under maintenance, try again later" at the checkout page, with no option to complete the purchase. The 60-odd parties that have expressed interest will be asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement that provides access to information about Booktopia's finances, and then interested parties will be asked to submit their non-binding indicative offers. Administrators will work through those and shortlist the best offers to proceed to the next stage of the process, where parties will be asked to submit final binding offers before the end of the month. And criminals using diamond-studded watches, designer handbags and high-end jewellery to launder their ill-gotten gains have been flagged as a very high risk by the financial crimes watchdog. AUSTRAC Chief Executive Brendan Thomas has revealed luxury goods along with cash and real estate had received the highest risk rating from authorities because they were highly effective for laundering money. Mr. Thomas also revealed AUSTRAC was looking into social media platform TikTok over concerns in its in-app payment platform was vulnerable to abuse. TikTok operates a payment system that lets users give gifts in the form of digital gold to people streaming on the site that can be redeemed for real money. The system has become popular among the site's younger user base. But in 2022, a Turkish government news site reported that local authorities had found millions of dollars were being transferred via TikTok to accounts suspected to be linked to terrorist groups. Mr. Thomas said preliminary investigation showed TikTok was not covered under Australia anti-money laundering laws because it operated out of Singapore, but its payment platform PayPal was. The AUSTRAC boss said he had written to his sister agency in Singapore to open discussions about how TikTok's operations in Australia could be given proper scrutiny, adding that social media was an area of serious concern. And NDIS Minister Bill Shorten said payments for sex work will be banned under changes to the scheme, conceding a wide range of services being billed to taxpayers are unsustainable. Mr Shorten slammed the opposition and the Greens for dragging out passage of legislation to overhaul exploding costs, saying another round of parliamentary hearings will slug the budget by $1.1 billion, the equivalent of paid packages for as many as 60,000 children. We want to issue regulations which can't get rolled, which say you don't get to spend your money, and I kid you not, on cryptocurrency or steam rooms, or in one case, people trying to organise 20 people to go to Japan. It's not on. Asked if payments for sex work would be banned, Mr Shorten said such a move was necessary, even if cases were isolated. We will rule it out. That's just not a sustainable proposition, he said. The rules have been a bit loose at the margins. Let's just tell the truth. But the coalition on Sunday said it would not be bullied into supporting changes proposed by the federal government, insisting a further Senate inquiry was necessary to stop the scheme's cost outstripping Medicare, aged care and the pension. The $42 billion program is already on track to overtake the age pension within 3 years as the most expensive area of government spending. Labor's attempts to cut the annual growth rate to 8% are being held up by Coalition and Greens' plans for another inquiry. Just a decade old, the NDIS already costs more to run per year than the aged care system, $36 billion, Medicare, $32 billion, federal government funding for hospitals, $30 billion, and the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, $20 billion. Labor's changes would enact key recommendations from last year's NDIS review. About $14.4 billion would be saved, including an end to automatic top-ups when a participant uses all their allocated funds. The budget estimates that state and federal government's NDIS spending will reach $60.8 billion in 2027-28. The Parliamentary Budget Office's online budget tool shows the watchdog's baseline expectation is the NDIS to overtake the age pension in 2034-35, when both programs are expected to cost about $100 billion a year to operate. The legislation was referred to a Senate committee in March, with a final report released in June, but the Coalition and the Greens sent the legislation back to a Senate committee for another round of scrutiny, due to continue until August. Mr Shorten said the delay was unnecessary, and investments chiefs from the country's biggest superannuation funds will not bankroll Opposition Leader Peter Dutton's nuclear power plant, despite strong appetite for other energy transition assets and a shortage of domestic investment opportunities. Super CIO Damien Graham said the production timelines on nuclear were too long to help meet the fund's own net zero targets. For Mr Graham, nuclear did not meet the near-time emissions reduction strategies needed to invest in to meet its energy transition targets. These included a 45% reduction in Scope 1 and 2 emissions in its portfolio and net zero by 2050. We're working towards that, and that doesn't involve investing in nuclear, Mr Graham said. It's a long-term build, no doubt about it, and we need to be making really clear progress by 2030. He pointed to renewables and other transition-supporting technologies as attractive investment opportunities for the $170 billion super fund instead. Mr Dutton pledged 2 nuclear power plants would be operational by 2035 under his plan, and more potentially by 2037 if he was elected next year, despite the CSIRO estimating the first full operation of a station would be no sooner than 2040. Graham's counterpart at UniSuper, John Pearce, said nuclear investments would not make money for members fast enough, while CBIS ruled it out completely. The investment bosses of half a dozen funds also agreed there was not enough policy certainty to justify any serious consideration of nuclear energy investments. Broader appetite for private investment in nuclear has been low, with Mr Dutton conceding his scheme will need to be publicly funded, despite the Liberal Party's historic dislike of state-owned energy. Fund's dismissal of nuclear also comes as they pour billions of dollars into renewables, and Treasurer Jim Chalmers calls on the $3.6 trillion sector to deploy some of its ever-growing asset pools into nation-building, like the energy transition. The main reason is the payback time is way too long for us. We're taking decades, not just years, Mr Pearce said on possible investment in nuclear. We know that nuclear is proven, scalable technology, and you've got your ESG considerations as well as economic, but from that economic side, it just doesn't stack up as an investment for a super fund like for us. CBIS CIO Brett Chatfield said, "We don't see nuclear as a part of the energy transition going forward." CBIS, which is chaired by former Labor Treasurer Wayne Swan, has been the biggest backer of nation-building projects to date, including, as the only super fund, to invest in the government's controversial Housing Australia Future Fund. But Mr Chatfield said the fund was much more focused on the renewable energy, particularly onshore and offshore wind and solar, when it came to supporting the energy transition. Other chief investment officers said proposed policies to introduce nuclear power in Australia were too vague to justify considering investment. And Network 10's future is uncertain, with Paramount Global, the troubled Hollywood conglomerate that owns a diverse array of businesses including Network 10, Paramount Plus, Paramount Studios, CBS, MTV, Nickelodeon and Channel 5 in the UK, agreeing to a significant merger with film production studio Skydance Pictures. The deal sees a billionaire Ellison family acquire the controlling stakes in Paramount from the Redstone family. The US $4.75 billion merger resulting in Network 10, often considered a secondary asset for the American company, falling under the ownership of the Ellisons. Larry Ellison, the patriarch who amassed his wealth through Oracle, a US $400 billion software giant listed on the NYSE, and his son David Ellison, the founder of Skydance, responsible for hits like Top Gun and Terminator, are at the helm of this strategic move. The future direction for Network 10 under the Ellison family remains uncertain. In a press release announcing the transaction, Skydance indicated plans to bolster Paramount platforms through the enhanced technology and infrastructure. The statement also mentioned improvements to Paramount's traditional television network, although it did not specifically name Network 10. And in new revelations, outgoing Senator Linda Reynolds, who needs the money to back up the millions in her parliamentary super, your taxes at work, makes a last-minute claim in her lawsuit against Brittany Higgins that Anthony Albanese's closest confidants, Katie Gallagher and Penny Wong, were drip-fed false information by David Shiraz and Brittany Higgins as part of a larger plan to destroy the career of Reynolds and take down the Morrison government. The explosive court documents allege Mr Shiraz also organised meetings between Ms Higgins and Labor members of Parliament to discuss her rape allegations, the documents say, including then Opposition Leader Mr Albanese and Tanya Plibersek, as well as former Liberal Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and former Labor Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. The extraordinary claims form part of Senator Reynolds' case against Ms Higgins in the West Australian Supreme Court, where she is suing her former employee over a series of social media posts she says defamed her. Senator Reynolds claimed the Instagram, Twitter and Thread posts mishandled the allegations of rape against the former Liberal staffer Bruce Lemon by failing to provide her with any support. The case is set down for trial on August 2nd, following multiple failed mediation talks. And that's it for this week. And next week I'll be talking to Alex Perry, the Managing Director of investment company Sharewise. Alex has a strong history of working in the investment management industry. We'll talk about how geopolitical conflicts in the Ukraine and Gaza are affecting markets. And we'll talk about the market impact of the US presidential election in November. And I'll talk to RMIT economist Sinclair Davidson about whether this downturn is worse than the GFC. For the most exclusive access to leading economists and business leaders from around the world, subscribe to Talking Business from my website, leongetler.com. If you like Talking Business, please leave us a review with Apple Podcasts. Thank you in advance. In the meantime, you catch me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn and YouTube. And if you want, leave a comment. If you want to contact me, email me at leon@leongetler.com. I answer all emails. Also, in my copious spare time, I have a copywriting business. If anyone needs newsletters, blogs, articles or advertorial, email me. Wishing you all a safe and healthy week and looking forward to bringing Talking Business next week.